So for me, the question here is blockchain, separating it from Bitcoin, separating it from Ether, although we may want to come back and talk about both of those as part of the conversation in a bit. But the basic idea that we put on the cover of The Economist 2 years ago, that there's this new kind of, it's a trust engine. Somehow it's an ability to take away from traditional intermediaries their raison d'etre and actually say we can do all this in software that essentially means people don't need to pay all that money to intermediaries. And obviously, given how much money the finance industry makes as an intermediary, that is potentially quite a challenge to the business model. And so I just wanted to start off, I'll start with you, R.A. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, obviously, it's an interesting technology. That it's an amalgamation of many, many other innovations that came about. And it's starting in 2008 with the famous Nakamoto paper, became the blockchain, the model that we use today. And obviously, once you develop it, you want to come up with use cases. And in his case, it was a digital currency. I mean, the old adage was that if you want to become rich, a good way to do it is to invent a new religion. Perhaps because you get tax-deferred status, perhaps you can add to it to invent your own currency, and that's another good way to become rich fast. So, but unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there. This knowledge gap that I like to refer to creates a lot of misconceptions of what blockchain is versus Bitcoin versus cryptocurrencies, digital tokens, and so on and so forth. And I feel like, part of my role would be to, hopefully close that knowledge gap and be able to empower, all the attendees and folks in the industry who don't have a technical background to understand this, but understand it from the top down as opposed to bottoms up. I mean, I make the analogy that this is like akin to you being a general contractor. You don't need to be up to code on all the latest things, regulation in building a house, but you have a good understanding of all the pieces come together. So blockchain per se has a lot of potential, not just in intermediating anyone that provides trust or provides a service to you, but now with the advent of digital tokens, we can truly do some amazing things that prior to this was not possible. I'll give you an example. So I'm sure all of you have heard of IP or TCP or HTTP. These are all different protocols used to enable communications on the internet. And the P at the end always stands for protocol. But how many of you actually know who built these protocols that enable your emails to go through and your communications through internet go through? Not many, right? And they were not the ones who monetized the building of these capabilities. Now with digital tokens and protocol level blockchains, we can create something that's totally decentralized and allows everyone to participate and not have any trust issues and be able to build lots of things, then monetize it. So if we can close the knowledge gap, we'll be able to achieve a lot more. Also take a lot of fear out of the big banks that they see this as a threat. It could also be an opportunity. Obviously.
But I mean, that, up to a point, true. But I mean, if you do see this massive disintermediation,
possible.
I mean,
not in the short term, but possible.
Banks so what time horizon do you see it?
Right now, banks are looking at it mostly on the back end, i.e. how can I cut costs and how can I use this to reduce my workforce and be able to be more efficient. I don't need 3 days to settle a trade. I can do it in minutes or seconds.
But I mean, if you look at the payment sector, for example, particularly
yes.
cross-border payments, I mean, you've seen dramatic reduction in commissions there.
Indeed, and the same thing that we saw in the equities trading market, we're probably going to see it in the bond market. But we talked about this in an earlier panel. Unless we have a very customer-friendly, customer-centric way of exchanging keys and exchanging information, you're not going to be seeing a mass adoption of payments, number one. And this notion of how to go from a fiat currency to a digital currency and not to have to deal with volatility that we're seeing is another challenge around that. So I would say back-end processes, those that save you money probably in the next 5 to 10 years, but things that might help you dislodge some of the incumbents or create brand new business lines probably down the line, because it's hitting the banks at the very, very core of what they do and what they have been doing for the past 500 years, providing trust.
Robert, let me bring you in first. Do you agree?
I think there's a lot of noise and a lot of misinformation that the myths have kind of created around this. You have the phrase blockchain or ledger, and that gives the impression that you're going to be able to go online and look at a single ledger and get rid of all those letters that come to you and all those statements that come to you and all the places you have to log in and see your information in one place. And that may occur in a couple of decades. But right now, there's basically an explosion of ledgers. There's an explosion of models. There's an explosion of protocols. I think if you count all the different dialects and all the different ways they're being implemented, you're probably into the 10,000s now, just in terms of taking this technology and how it could be leveraged, even in the financial industry, and then you can cross into other industries. Then you have the concept of getting rid of intermediaries, because we're going to now have the retail public managing all of their own money and all of their own investments and all of their exact retirement accounts and all of their public keys and private keys. That's another myth. There are new intermediaries around Bitcoin, around Ethereum. All the cryptocurrencies have brand new intermediaries. The idea of a no governance model, that the public will govern things. I think everything we've seen in the public cryptocurrency space and every discussion that's going on in the private space about how to do the right level of experiments and the right level of permissions says you need a governing function, whether that's a single organization, a group of organizations, a utility. All of that is probably evolving.
So we've had this example of payments, cross-border payments. So, we used to go and have to pay a vast amount to Western Union to get them to basically send money home to our relatives in Mexico. And now you basically go to Zappo, you put dollars in there, it's converted to Bitcoin, and then your relative in Mexico goes and turns the Bitcoin back into peso, and essentially they pay virtually nothing for that transaction. Those characteristics that are wiping out so much the intermediary fees in that payments market. Why wouldn't it happen in every other aspect of finance, like share trades or bond issuance or anything? It seems like, and if the big incumbents don't actually allow that to happen, why won't outsiders come in and?
Well, but I don't believe the big incumbents are not looking to take advantage of all the efficiencies of blockchain.
But they're not necessarily looking to pass on the cost savings to the customer.
I would think they absolutely. Certainly our role as an industry utility that is only focused on risk and cost reduction, there are no public shares. Our only compensation is if we reduce risk and cost. Blockchain is a part of our solution, and we will hopefully talk about some of the real work and real things we're seeing in that. So is cloud. When Nakamoto Satoshi wrote his paper, cloud was just emerging into the public horizon as a way of sharing things. Cloud dramatically reduces costs, reduces data center footprint, reduces capital outlay. Automation, what we're doing with robotics and what we're doing with machine learning. I think the real story is there's going to be a dramatic transformation of the whole financial industry, and all the firms that spoke on the previous panel that own DTCC are going through the same transformation. There's just going to be a dramatic cost takeout, and some of it is being driven by startups, but a lot of it is being driven by the technology and partnership.
And will it be a cost takeout or cost and profit takeout?
I'll say that's yet to be seen. DTCC is a not-for-profit organization, so that's not.
Doesn't mean that, but for others, you can take a view. No?
I think I will continue to trust others to manage my money because I've been particularly poor at it, and I think there's an entire globe of underserved people in terms of financial management. But whether it's Betterment or a new company or it's an incumbent, it'll be the value add.
Amen.
So I have a different take on this. So if I look at what's going on right now, I kind of see us as living the tail end of the golden age of finance. I view most of you as owning big horse farms, and there are people around now puttering around in this weird metallic contraption. And that metallic contraption is this blockchain engine. And it's in its beginning phases. It's not anywhere near comparable to what you can do with your horses. And I know that almost all of you in this room probably are very well versed in this technology, and you're probably doing proofs of concept. Most of those proofs of concept are technically not founded on good foundations. Those of you who are invested in private blockchains, for example, most likely are building monocultures. Every single one of your multiple replicas is running the same code. It's vulnerable to the same kinds of flaws. So, if I look at public blockchains, they have a whole slew of problems, not the least of which is the risk of an independent currency. So there are problems galore. And in addition to that, as was mentioned in the previous panel, there is a real problem that's sort of helping the horse owners, if you will, which is that the current technology is hampered by the fact that it relies on the security of our endpoints and the security of our usual systems, the systems we carry in our back pockets, the telephones, the mobile devices, and as well as the back-end servers, is nowhere near enough to handle high-value assets. So we hear of hacks all the time. That got mentioned in depth. I think Matthew ended up exploring that topic. So so that buys you time, if you will. Okay?
So you say but you're going to invent a new blockchain that will work. Is that what you're saying?
Not me necessarily, although I've played a role in doing this. But certainly the research community is working on building better technology. And that technology is coming down the pipe. So the two big problems I see are scale and security. And those are being addressed, there are people actively working on it. And it will severely disrupt what companies do. And it's going to be really interesting. And I think, as R.A. was mentioning, the winners in this race are going to be the companies that understand the core technology in depth and know how to retool their businesses around it. You can't just take a black box blockchain and replace your back end with it. It's a nonsensical starter. What does it mean to replace my database with especially for a current day blockchain? You're strictly going backwards in terms of your capabilities. You'll end up with an infrastructure that's slower than normal. So, but if you actually retool entirely, then you can actually suddenly open up amazing new techniques or amazing new functionality that wasn't possible before. So there, I think we're going to see amazing innovation in this space.
So, Robert, do you feel you're inventing slower horses then, essentially?
There's a lot in what Evan says that I agree with, but I'll take the project that we're doing now, where we're actually taking a mainframe system and we're moving it to distributed ledger. I prefer to use the term because blockchain is a particular model of distributed ledger. The world of financial institutions, and maybe it was said earlier, I missed all the panels, but there's some phrase from some bankers that we're a industry that does reconciliation and a little bit of banking. And a lot of that reconciliation is because each firm has its version of the database and its data schemas, its business rules, its business logic. Then they have translation layers. Then they have messaging layers to send it on to the next party. The idea of standardization that ISO and a lot of other organizations push is everyone implements it their own way. And everyone builds their own stacks their own way. And this is a huge challenge. And just upgrading from one standard to another takes decades, literally. Here, this technology is the same exact stack, and maybe it is in its infancy, and I completely agree with that. But if you had the same exact stack that could be deployed across an industry for a single asset class, you got rid of the translation layers, you got rid of any confusion about data schemas and data rules, you got rid of any issues with reconciliation on payments associated with a long-term transaction like a swap, and everyone is looking at the same exact information, there's a tremendous cost reduction and there's a tremendous savings that can come from that. So there's a huge promise in the base technology, even as it's currently evolving.
So, I want to push you a bit on your critique and your vision. The critique, first of all, we are seeing these private blockchain experiments proliferate. And what the flaw you say there is that they create a monoculture. Just spell that out for us.
Sure. So the science behind these systems is essentially one of what we call quorum systems. So you take your back-end engine that normally would be housed and managed by a single entity. You break it up into n different entities. And some threshold of those are sufficient to house the data, to legitimately speak for the collective. So that's the typical technique. And the idea behind the operation of such a system is that if somebody were to hack into one of those N, well, then they wouldn't control what's going on. In fact, they would have to compromise at least a threshold, a T subset of this. So that's great. But for it to work, there's a core independence assumption. If all these systems fail independently, they work beautifully. If they all run the same code, then the same hacker who broke into one will be able to use the same flaw to break into all. And so that's one of the core sort of very frequently committed errors that we see now. Is this going to change? Undoubtedly. Do we understand how to change it? Yes, we do too. And so I don't see this as a fundamental problem, but it is de jure problem. Like all of you face this right now. So, and there are others like this. We've seen lots and lots of flawed technologies deployed in the blockchain space, sometimes willingly and knowingly, and sometimes unknowingly by well-intentioned people. This is what to be expected.
So and then I want to switch to blockchain that's based on Bitcoin and blockchain with Ether. Both cases you have these currencies associated with them that seem to be, a reward for those that keep the system operating. Do you think your vision of this new improved blockchain that you see coming down the line, will it have a currency associated with it?
That's independent. Indeed, there will be cases where you want to provide incentives to people to participate, to provide resources into the collective. And in those cases, it might make sense to have your own virtual currency. For many applications that are of relevance to people here, you don't want another currency. I know at Cornell, for example, we went to our treasurer and said we'd like to hold some Bitcoin. And the answer was, it's hard enough for us to deal with euros. So you want us to hold this crazy currency. We can't do that. Our systems won't even let you enter it. Ironically enough, 3 weeks later, the treasurer came back to us and said, I need to buy Bitcoin. And we said, what beep got into your bonnet? And he said, well, we operate the Weill College up here, and we hear that there are all these ransoms that we have to pay. We have to be ready for it. So it's interesting. So these currencies are really hard to manage, and nobody really wants another currency, to be honest. And if you can actually get by and tap into the advantages of a blockchain without using a currency, by all means, you should do so.
But do you see, and I'm going to come to you, R.A., but I mean, you talk about the need for this better blockchain, better public blockchain in particular. What the main problem with the current one is, it's too slow, it's what?
The current public blockchain, so let me recast that question a little bit. I don't necessarily view, public blockchains are fine the way they operate. They suffer from a bunch of problems. Private blockchains also currently suffer from a set of problems. So the biggest problems with public blockchains I see right now is performance, scale, and security. So on the performance front, they have high latencies. Bitcoin has 10 minutes.
They're obviously changing. They're gradually moving. They fault and whatever. Yeah,
they're giving you time, right? They're fighting among each other to make that change. And because of the lack of the governance model that Robert alluded to, we're having difficulty on that front. But so performance is low. Scale is hard. The number of people they can support is low. If Venezuela converted to Bitcoin, every adult gets one transaction every 36 days. I mean, that's, imagine going to the store for...
Well, it's a bit like going to the store in Venezuela.
That's true, too. So, but it's just a non-starter at the moment that these things will really take off and take over the world. Its performance isn't there. And of course, the security problem I alluded to. These things are not secure in your phone. Somebody will hack in all your coins, and that happens daily to people I know. So
all right, what do you make of all this?
Well, we did in my lab, at my fintech lab at Columbia, we did a wide, really as wide of or deep dive rather into this world as we could. So we counted over 1,000 cryptocurrencies and hundreds upon startups, and we dug deep into see what is it that they're using, what's so special about them. And we started cross-correlating, and it's amazing how, if you can boil it down to just a few protocols and few pieces and how they're just riffing off each other's work, and should any of those things fail, or be hacked, the systematic impact on the entire system. So,
but the Bitcoin and Ethereum seem to have emerged as the two.
As the obviously top two, but they were built today, exactly. And who knows what's going to happen later on. But the fundamental.
But why would those two be how would they lose their leadership at this point?
Well, you could find out by looking on my Palm Pilot at the Alta Vista page for my MySpace page. And there I describe very clearly why first movers.
In my humble opinion, there's a lot of interesting theories that have been able to codify over the past 20 years on disruptive innovation, how it comes about. So you look at Bitcoin and Ethereum, comparing it, and you talk to the community, you realize more people are optimistic about Ethereum than about Bitcoin. Probably the reason being that there are more protocols, more other cryptocurrencies that are leveraging Ethereum as the baseline, as a standard, and building off of that. There are other fundamental questions that we need to ask. Is Bitcoin meant to be a currency to facilitate trade and transactions, or is it something to store value like gold? Are we truly kind of believing that there are only two mutually exclusive systems, totally decentralized or totally centralized? Could we have a hybrid? All these governance issues that came about in the DAO and the failure of it, and the fact that lots and lots of smart people were looking at the code prior to being implemented, and they missed a fairly simple and yet profound mistake in the code. Well, that's a cause to worry. You don't want to have a system that might fail on such scale. So the notion of scalability also. I mean, I have a feeling we will figure it out. Just like the way when we built internet, it wasn't built right from the get-go for 7 billion people to be on it. It was 10 million, 50, and so on. But as internet itself is showcasing on a daily basis, it wasn't built to handle all the things we wanted to handle. Security is terribly bad. And this is the problem with most innovation, that the innovators are terrible at predicting the actual use case for the invention. One story I'd like to share is the one of Thomas Edison. When he invented the phonograph, he kind of sat down with his crew, and they were trying to see what the killer app or killer use for this invention is. And him being who he is at the age and the place he was at, they thought, oh, this actually is going to be the perfect device, such that you can have one at home and you can listen to different sermons at different time of the day. And it turned out the killer app for phonograph was actually music, not sermons, right? So any invention you could use for good or bad. It just how the community as a whole will come together and support it. And hopefully for the researchers to be able to push through some of this innovation in this incredibly dynamic space to the actual implementers and actual companies. So that's my 2 cents on that.
So what I'm hearing from you, though, is we shouldn't really expect the blockchain to be really fundamentally shaking up intermediation for a while yet, because it's still very much an emerging technology. And
it is.
We often hear, Silicon Valley people always talk about how it's 1995 in the internet all over again.
I'd like to point
they've been saying that for several years, but where are we in that whole process?
I'd like to just use the model of the app that we actually are moving. We're moving a mainframe app to use distributed ledger. The vendors that we're working with have a stack based on Ethereum as the technology. And the nice thing about a model that Ethereum is pursuing, leaving the currency aside, is that it's gaining broad usage. It's gaining a lot of people to test. It's gaining wide adoption, and it's open source. And a lot of those are really components of trying to get something hardened. The challenge is that the language supporting Ethereum, this thing called Solidity, that is used for smart contracts, doesn't support decimals. It only supports 32-byte key value pairs, which in plain English means none of your descriptors could be longer than 32 bytes. And if you have information more than 32 characters, you have to start splitting it up or moving it in different places. So there's a lot of complexity with this kind of building an app with this kind of language. There's also almost no, and to the earlier comments about the technology evolution, there's limited tools. So if there's a problem anywhere in the contract, you'll get a message like out of gas. As opposed to the decades of improvement in languages like Java or JavaScript that have fairly robust debugging environments right now. But at the same time, we're making progress. We're taking a mainframe application, moving it to a distributed ledger. We're able to replicate the ledger in multiple nodes. We're able to leverage the cloud, and the cloud vendors have been very supportive in making this stuff work. So we're pushing down the path with an expected goal that we will take our current intermediary role, where we keep the gold copy of credit default swap trades, and we will kind of exit that intermediary role but we will be a governance and network operator or potentially one of the network operators for that model.
But I hear you saying
it's a leader role.
I hear you saying Ethereum is closer to Facebook than MySpace, though. Is that what you're saying?
It's a step on the path to the future, but in 5 years, it's so early. You have to expect that anything you do today, you're going to be redoing in 5 years.
Okay, we got questions.
If I may add just one quick
Okay.
point to this. For those of you who like literature, you may remember a quote from the book Sun Also Rises by Hemingway, in which one character is asking the other, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer is simple, slowly and gradually at first, and all of a sudden. I have a feeling disruption also works the same way. So despite, obviously us being at the beginning of the first inning in this entire endeavor, you have to pay attention to it. And also the fact that it's become incredibly complex thing, such that no one person or one person with one expertise could potentially help you understand the implication and the applications and the implementations. It requires, business people and the engineers and the researchers and the storytellers and all. So,
from the app, do we end up with 1, 2, or a handful of blockchain platforms, or will the platforms vary by industry or use case?
So my view on this is very, very simple. We're going to end up with a huge collection of different platforms. Yes, there will be, so within every niche, there might be some outliers that really stick out. But we will have many, many, many different platforms, and that is a wonderful outcome. We want the technology to compete, and we want that competition to happen between different functional specs. We don't want that to happen within, at the human level, within a single team. We can't possibly have a uniform one-size-fits-all. And also the governance of sort of the one ledger that rules them all is impossible. Just we know that from human endeavors.
So either of you disagree with that?
Completely agree, but standards and interoperability are the only way we'll get to any useful endpoint.
Genetic diversity is always a good thing. So you don't want to be dependent on one system that should it fail, it affects the entire system. By the same token, indeed, operating between systems is also critical.
So this phrase came up, smart contract. We'll come to you in a second. So smart contracts, which was a bit of a buzzy term a couple of years ago. Has anything happened with that smart contracts yet?
Yes, tons of things have happened with smart contracts. Ethereum emerged as the initial smart contract platform where you could, so for those of you in the audience.
Just explain what it is.
Well, let me just very quickly define it. A smart contract is a program that manages money flows according to a preset algorithmic recipe. So for the easiest way to think of it is if you and I are musicians and we want to disintermediate our manager, we can just say, look, of the money that comes in through revenues, 70% goes to you and 30% goes to me for playing the drums in the back or whatever. So that way, all of these things that you read in the newspaper about people suing their managers, you've just taken them out. You replace them with a program. Of course, these things can get very, very complicated. And imagine that contract now becoming much more interesting. It could be an insurance company wholesale. It could provide peer-to-peer insurance. It could do all sorts of other things that we probably don't have the time to mention. So have they happened? Yes, by all means. Do we see this? There was an effort about a year ago to have essentially something like a VC fund / Kickstarter combined. There's something called the DAO, which was a digital autonomous organization. It was supposed to function as essentially a collection of money that everybody pools their funds together, and it makes awards to enterprising people, to entrepreneurs. And
that didn't work out so well.
Did not work out so well, and I was involved in foreseeing some of the problems to come. And in fact, there was a hacker who came in, stole $53 million or so worth of tokens, and used, the two tricks he used. One of them was something that we had found.
But these frothy initial coin offerings, are they part of the same? Do you call those smart contracts? Or?
Some of them are implemented as smart contracts, and essentially those are different. They might be implemented as smart contracts, but the entire ICO space is a different thing. Quite a few of them are blockchains of their own, and a fair number of them are built on top of another blockchain and implement a token. We should keep those two separate, I think. because one is a bigger term.
But do you think that the ICO is, I mean, we heard earlier in the venture capital panel, I mean, potentially disintermediating traditional venture capital?
Well, in theory, it could. I mean, Consensus, the Venture Academy, right now, they're building their own investment banking practice, believe it or not. So anyone wanting to do an ICO would go to them, get the stamp of approval, doing the same job that Goldman Sachs or Citibank or Bank of America had done in the past. And guess what? Citibank, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs should also start thinking about this. So,
But not JP Morgan, we understand.
But it's an incredibly fascinating field. But I make it a mission of mine to inhabit the intersection of academia and practice. Lots of great things we can do in theory will have some challenges in practice. I mean, the smart contracts. These are contracts, as Gun mentioned. That's pretty much the code is the law. So code will determine what will happen should a dispute happen or anything of that sort. Well, as far as I know, perhaps with the exception of one instance, I have yet to see a bug-free software being developed right off the bat. So software is written by humans, so there's going to be certain challenges and problems with the bugs. So should there be a hack problem? And unfortunately, you had the flu when the DAO failed, so perhaps if you didn't have the flu, we could have discovered the bug. And this also begs the other questions. How would the future of a law firm look like? Should they go about hire the best programmers that they could possibly hire to ensure that they can read all the contracts and ensure everything is up to stuff that should be? Or law firms, could they even hope to hire any good programmers when they have an option of going to work for Google or any other fund companies? How would a dispute that was not foreseen in the contract be addressed? So these are really kind of a Pandora's box of questions. And we're not going to even get to talk about the regulatory framework. That's a whole separate thing. So they have a lot of promise for sure, and will save a lot of money, a lot of time, but the actual implementation of it will take much longer.
Okay, well, there's...
Keep it
several,
short, please.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, then we'll just stick with smart contracts. So those smart contracts that are built to respond to stimuli, a date, a market price hitting a threshold, and the inherent spoofability, to coin I don't know if that's really a word, but spoofing of smart contracts, and none of the models that are out there seem to be addressing the meta system in which they operate.
That's a very good point. So smart contracts are typically not entities that live solely on the blockchain. They have to interact with their environment. So what we're seeing with Ethereum and Solidity is the execution engine. And what we haven't seen is what we call the runtime, the things around the program that allow it to interact with its environment. In particular, many smart contracts will need to take inputs from the outside, something we call oracles, that tell them, indeed, the stock price of Ford was this price, and therefore you can do that. So there's lots of exciting work, some from our initiative at Cornell, done by my colleague Ari Jules, on building a system that he calls Town Crier. And it's essentially a secure oracle that is trustless. And what he uses is secure hardware, which is another invention that's just became available about a year ago. Secure hardware allows you to run code whose behavior you understand in isolation outside the blockchain. And so the secure oracles can import factoids into your system about what happened in the external world. But by all means, there's going to be a lot more research in that space to expand that ecosystem.
We're working with those issues today, and the implementation is basically using Solidity and having things on-chain and off-chain. And sometimes the things that go on-chain immediately need to be queried by things on-chain and off-chain. So you have not just oracles of static data, you have this issue of information that is in a contract needs to be informed to all other contracts. I'll say we're learning a lot, and we're seeing the limitations of the environment and working with the industry and the vendor to figure out how to upgrade it.
So
a
last question to all of you, as we're almost out of time. Would any of you consider investing in an initial coin offering? And if so, what criteria would you use to evaluate that decision?
Great question. So I've been involved in advising quite a few ICOs. and I look for 3 criteria. One is cool core tech. So if it doesn't have cool core technology, and I don't know what cool core really, can't really define it.
Cool core.
Yeah, cool, some core tech that lies at the heart that is really an innovative thing. If they're reinventing something that already exists, I am not interested. The second thing I look for is a credible team that will carry out the vision. And the third one is at least the initial formation of a community. All of these new systems require a group behind them, a community behind them, and they don't succeed if they don't have a healthy community, as we have seen with Bitcoin sort of running into the weeds recently. So it's crucial. Those are the 3 crucial things I look for.
So have any of them met that criteria yet?
Yes, I have advised quite a few. Some of you might have heard of Tezos, for example, that did quite well, as well as others.
Robert?
Well, DTCC is focused on risk management, and most of the people who work there are very risk-oriented people. So I'm observing the ICO industry with interest, but from a distance.
Well, in addition to what Gun mentioned, I'm also interested in tokens that actually have a utility function. They're not just yet another vehicle to trade or exchange money, but actually serve a purpose. Like, Golem is of interest, and Filecoin is of
Because
interest.
what is their utility?
Utility function means that they, as I alluded to earlier, on a protocol level, they actually serve a function. For those of you who remember SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, it was a way to get a lot of data, radio signals from our atmosphere, cut it into small pieces, give it to as many people as would download the software, and whenever your computer would go on the screensaver would go on, it would use your unused processing power to churn and iterate data and report it back to the center. So it's the same idea around distributed Amazon Web Services, if you will, or for hosting files. So that's what the utility function would be.
Great. So I think that means that we shouldn't regard them as maybe Jamie Dimon does, that they're a total fraud, but maybe there's some that are worth investing in.